Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down the arguments in a pretty fiery commentary about a controversial social media post from a former president. Now, our goal here isn't to agree or disagree, but really just to understand the specific case that's being made in our source material.
Okay, let's just dive right in. We have to start with the social media post that kicked this whole thing off. According to the commentary we're looking at, their entire argument is built around this one message, so it's really important to see exactly what was said.
So right off the bat, the source frames this message as a major break from history, They set up this really sharp contrast between how presidents used to talk and, well, this.
And this slide really shows you what they're getting at. It's their first big point. They put this post's raw language right next to these iconic, more traditional quotes from presidents like Washington, JFK, and Reagan. The whole point is to highlight just how different, and in their view, how shocking this message really was.
So, you've got this post out there. What happened next? Well, the commentary doesn't just leave it hanging. The next step in their argument is to lay out the huge backlash that it got, like immediately.
According to our source material, the public and media criticism really boiled down to these three key things. The strong language, the profanity, the timing, posting it on Easter Sunday of all days, and what a lot of people saw as him mocking another religion.
And to show this wasn't just some, random chatter, the author points to specific things the media said. They use this on-air warning as a perfect example of the shock and concern that mainstream news outlets were expressing about the language in the post. They also pull examples from social media, like this tweet you see here. And, as the commentary presents it, this kind of critique really gets to the heart of the conflict people saw between Trump's professed faith and this aggressive post on a major Christian holiday.
Okay, so we've seen the post, we've seen the outrage, but here's where the whole argument takes a sharp turn. The commentary then starts to systematically take apart each of those criticisms to build this really detailed defense of the original post.
So the first move in this defense is to accuse some in the media of, well, basically changing the post. The author argues that some news outlets censored it by cutting out the phrase, "Praise be to Allah," and they claim that phrase is absolutely essential to understanding what the message was actually about.
And from the author's point of view, that missing phrase changes everything. They argue the sarcasm wasn't this broad mockery of Islam, but a direct, taunting challenge aimed right at the Iranian leadership. It was like saying, "Go ahead, call on your God for help. He won't save you from this."
So what about the charges of mocking religion, and that it's not something a Christian leader should do? Well, to counter that, the source draws this parallel to the biblical story of Elijah mocking the prophets of Baal. By doing this, they're trying to reframe the post not as a crude insult, but as a form of political and even religious satire.
And this idea of satire is really the key to their whole defense. They're suggesting that the post was this calculated, strategic use of ridicule. It was a tool, they say, to expose what they see as the hypocrisy of the Iranian regime, not just some profanity-laced rant. So once that defense is laid out, the argument kind of zooms out. It moves away from this one social media post and becomes this much broader commentary on two totally different ways of doing foreign policy. You can see it right here. The source draws a direct line between the diplomatic style of the previous administration, which they describe as apologetic and claim it funded terror, and Trump's aggressive, unconventional style, which they frame as being direct and threatening. Now this is interesting. The source uses this slide as their proof. They hold up this headline as direct evidence that the aggressive, satirical, and threatening approach actually got results, forcing Iran to the negotiating table in a way that, in their view, traditional diplomacy never could.
All right, next up, the author turns their sights on the media. This is their next big point, a really sharp critique of how they believe the media constantly frames these events, arguing that there's always this predetermined negative story. The source uses examples like these to make their case. They argue that media outlets will deliberately spin Trump's actions in the worst possible light. A successful rescue mission becomes a near failure, and a conflict against a hostile regime is framed as a chaotic war that might actually hurt America. And all of this leads to their core theory. They give it a name, Trump derangement syndrome. And they argue that all this negative criticism isn't really based on a logical look at his actions, but that it actually comes from a pre-existing anti-American bias among his critics. And that brings us to the grand finale of their argument. It's a really challenging and provocative conclusion that turns the spotlight completely away from the former president and shines it right back on his critics and on Western society itself. So they throw this question out there, right? Where should the outrage be directed?
And it's really designed to make you stop and think for a second, to set the stage for their final overarching point about what they see as misplaced priorities.
And this is it. This is the ultimate argument of the source material. The commentator concludes that the massive outrage over a social media post, when compared to the outrage over the Iranian regime itself, reveals a deeply misplaced sense of priorities. The final question they leave you with is, what really deserves our condemnation?